So in your unique position, having gone from service to veteran status to serving veterans, how do you believe your military experience has enhanced your ability to represent veterans?
Well, I think there's just a baseline credibility that I have, and that doesn't say other attorneys don't have credibility, but when I talk to a veteran and I share my veteran experience, I think they automatically know there's a lot of things they don't have to unpack with me. And I think that's very helpful, especially when I can discuss very specific sort of cultural things or organizational things that may have influenced their experience or their claim. And I understand maybe the power dynamics, the way authority kind of interact in the military that can, I think, put clients at ease just knowing they're speaking to somebody that already really understands their experience, and then it's just going to be a deeper dive into the specifics of their claim.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Welcome to our podcast, Victory Over VA, your guide to unlocking your disability benefits. If you're a veteran who is applying for VA disability benefits, this is the podcast for you. Subscribe and listen to our discussion of developments in VA disability. So welcome to today's show. I'm Francis Jackson. This is Chris McGhee, and we're at Jackson and MacNichol, a law firm that is devoted to helping veterans get justice on their VA disability benefits. So what is this about? Well, today we're going to talk about Chris's journey from service to veteran status to helping veterans. And who is this show for? Well, it's obviously for veterans, but it's also for those who care about veterans, whether we're talking family or members of the community. So without further ado, let me turn to Chris. And Chris, can you share with our viewers your personal journey from serving in the military to becoming a veteran to becoming a VA disability attorney?
Yes, so I served in the Air Force for 20 years. I worked in aircraft maintenance on fighter aircraft. And interestingly enough, even doing that job is similar to what the job I do now. First of all, you have to know the regulations inside and out in order to do your job correctly. You also have to problem solve as a course of business. And sometimes you have to advocate for your unit, your people, as a supervisor, as a technician. So I'm not sure if I had the skill set before the military and it honed it, or if I kind of developed it in the military. But at the end of my career, I really solidified that I was going to pursue being an attorney, which was a goal that I had long before I joined the military. And I came to Maine because that's where I wanted to live. It was the first time I got to pick where I wanted to live in my life, and I picked Maine. And went to law school, and I was almost 40 years old when I went to law school, so I was definitely a non-traditional student, but I had a lot of the education benefits available to me. So law school, I wasn't as stressed as probably the younger students that were taking on student loans and had to establish themselves. I actually interned at Jackson MacNichol in summer of 2020, and that's where I really began to understand the veterans disability law. And of course, I started a lot of advocacy work in 2018, where I was trying to make broader systemic changes for service member and ultimately veteran benefit. And so it just seemed like this was an evolutionary step in my service, my advocacy, and then as an attorney.
So in your unique position, having gone from service to veteran status to serving veterans, how do you believe your military experience has enhanced your ability to represent veterans?
Well, I think there's just a baseline credibility that I have, and that doesn't say other attorneys don't have credibility, but when I talk to a veteran and I share my veteran experience, I think they automatically know there's a lot of things they don't have to unpack with me. And I think that's very helpful, especially when I can discuss very specific sort of cultural things or organizational things that may have influenced their experience or their claim. And I understand maybe the power dynamics, the way authority kind of interacts in the military that can, I think, put clients at ease just knowing they're speaking to somebody that already really understands their experience, and then it's just going to be a deeper dive into the specifics of their claim, and we kind of get to the important stuff rather quickly, it feels like.
So it sounds like your background, you think, helps you connect with veterans and advocate for them.
Yeah, I think so. And obviously, our clients don't know necessarily about all of the advocacy work that I was doing because that was for my own sort of side project. But I think that, for me at least, speaks to like my goal is to solve these problems that are impacting so many people. And I would imagine it probably comes through in how I interact or what I say, I would imagine.
Was there any particular thing that motivated you to specialize in VA disability law after your military service?
Well, certainly, I mean, there's probably too long to discuss here, but essentially I view the VA disability process as the avenue of redress for military service members because as service members, they are denied so many avenues of redress. The VA essentially becomes their workers' compensation claim, their employment and labor rights sort of avenue. And so it just feels like it is a righting or a correction to some of these experiences that people have had in the military. And for me, going through my own VA disability claims process, I understood the law, not perfectly, but as a veteran going through it, I had to learn it and understand it, what was important. And when I interned here in 2020, it also kind of honed that understanding as well. But for me, it felt like there was a very easy marriage between my broader policy advocacy work and also direct advocacy for our veteran clients.
That makes sense. Can you comment on some of the challenges that veterans face when navigating the VA system and how your experience helps you to focus in and address those issues?
So I think the VA disability system, when you haven't studied it or you don't understand it, I think it can just feel arbitrary or obtuse or just not prone for easy navigation or even interpretation of what it means. And plus, just the size of the VA, there's a certain amount of bureaucratic layers and processes, and I think that also can frustrate clients. And I think veterans that have mental health conditions, I think trying to navigate these things in particular can be very frustrating, off-putting, and ultimately that's where my experience going through this process as a customer of the VA, continuing to be a customer of the VA, but also a advocate on behalf of our veteran clients. It allows me to know what frustrating things I experienced or the things that frustrated me the most and essentially address those things at the outset so that way they can kind of go in eyes wide open with how it's going to be and assure them that this is the likely outcome, but we're going to do this and this, so don't get frustrated at this first step type of deal.
From your perspective, what are some of the most critical aspects of VA disability claims that veterans without your background often overlook?
So I think something that's really important is having a diagnosis. That's one of the first steps establishing service connection for a disability is having a diagnosis or even just a description of the symptoms, something you can point to and say, this is what I'm currently experiencing right now. I think a lot of clients get kind of wrapped around the in-service event without recognizing that we also need to show that there's something currently going on, and it's important to redirect them on those things. But another issue is, as we've kind of talked about before, I think it's very hard to capture the in-service event if you were not proactive or anticipating a future need for an evidentiary, capturing the evidence, going to the doctor or being on a profile of some kind. That's really important, and I think a lot of people don't appreciate at the time, and there's a lot of regret when they're looking back in hindsight. So those two are probably the two that I think of off the top of my head.
For folks who are not service members and are looking to learn about that issue and help veterans, can you just explain what a profile is?
Yeah, so a profile is essentially when you are injured in some sort of way or you are below maximum capacity for performance, the military will essentially document that you have been injured in some way or you can't perform your job for some particular reason, and they will annotate it in your record to show that for this period of time you have a reduced workload, maybe reduced exercise requirements, and that type of profile can serve as evidence that something happened on this date while you're in service.
In your practice, do you feel that you can address the emotional and mental aspects of disability claims?
Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of that comes from just being in the military. And this, I don't say this to suggest that it's not perceptible by somebody that wasn't, but being in the military is a stressful environment. Separate from the job, just the dynamics and the culture, the amount of authority, those things can all kind of weigh on people. And when I interact with clients that have maybe some mental health conditions, I think they place expectations on themselves for performance. It could be anything, returning my phone call or returning a piece of a form or a piece of evidence or something like that. I typically try to, when I call them up, one of the first things I do is I ask them if it's a good time to talk, because it may not be a good time to talk. And initiating a conversation that might also reference triggering events when it's not a good time to talk is not going to have a good outcome for them or for me in order to get what I need. So a lot of times I ask them that question first and let them know it's okay to say no, and I can call back. And the second piece also is just letting them know that doing their best is good enough for this process. And it's my job to carry on for everything that they may not be able to do right now. And I think just giving them that grace to allow them to sit with their status and their environment, I think it allows them to decompress. It's not going, I mean, this process is already super stressful. There's people with disabilities that aren't compensated, or at least not compensated to the degree necessary. There's potential financial strain, and me calling up and kind of asking of them more than they might be able to give in that moment is only going to exacerbate the situation. So I really try to show up with as much grace and forgiveness as possible.
So how does your firsthand knowledge of military life and culture influence the way you approach the disability claims?
So I approach it, I did a paper for my master's degree that talked all about why military employment is drastically different from employment in the civilian sector. So I approach it through the lens of our veteran clients went through an experience where maybe there was no limit on the amount of hours they worked, the amount of days they worked, the breaks taken. There was no, essentially, maybe there was no access to a union, maybe there's restrictions on speech. It's just a very different dynamic that is very constricting. And when they transition out of the military and they carry some of those effects with them, I think when I talk to them and when we interact, I think it's one of the first times they get to, I mean, not the first time, but I think it's very important they feel heard about their experience, and there's no convincing required, because a lot of times I'm telling them, okay, this is how the military behaves, this is the effects you might see, and this is why your current situation is what it is. I think it's very validating, and I think it's an important part, because I think for a large portion of people's military career, a lot of times when someone says they're hurt or injured or says something is wrong, a lot of times the response is essentially to downplay it. And I think that's really quite tragic.
And that's something that seems like we see in a lot of our cases. The veterans come to us with this military mindset where they are thinking they have to persevere despite handicaps, and it's somehow not appropriate to talk about the extent of the difficulties they're having, and they try to minimize them, and often to their disadvantage in VA claims.
Yeah, and I think there's also, this is probably a broader topic. I think there are a couple things at play. First, I think generally in society, when people think of disabled veterans, very often I think they think of veterans that were disabled in the course of combat. And I think a lot of veterans, myself included, internalize that perception. And when your injury is sustained because you were removing and installing a jet engine over the last 15 years or bending down to pick things up, I think there's a bit of shame that you were simply injured just for doing your task. There was no enemy that injured you. I think there's also when service members such as myself project outward that they're put together, when, you know, this is a mask for the disabilities that I might have, and they see another veteran that has like significant traumas and injuries, amputations and things. I think there's a real shame that I'm seeking disability ratings and look what that veteran is experiencing. And I think that acts almost as a deterrence, because it's almost like the injuries you sustained are not good enough to complain about, especially when you see other veterans in a much worse place. But I think it's really important to reframe that you have no avenues of redress for injuries sustained in military service except for through the VA, typically.
Yeah, we have had a number of veterans who asked if they could even apply for benefits if they weren't injured in combat. It's, you know, as you're saying, I think there's a real warped perception about that.
Yeah.
But let me ask you, what advice would you give to veterans based on your legal expertise and your personal experience in the military taken together?
Well, I think it's that persistence piece. A lot of what I did in the military just required a lot of hard work of pushing through, sort of rallying your team together, but also just not giving up and not quitting. And I think that's necessary for this process. And working with a organization like Jackson MacNichol that has a very broad sort of resource network in order to help veterans in their claims through their attorneys, but also staff and so on and so forth. I think that's really important for the process. And that allows that persistence and perseverance to maybe be a little bit easier when it's a shared load, much like in the military. We didn't do anything by ourselves. It was us together as a team. And then also, luckily, the military has perfectly prepared us for the concept of hurry up and wait, which is instilled in you at basic training and then essentially through the entire course of your career. I think veterans are uniquely qualified to hurry up and wait. And that's kind of what the VA process is, unfortunately, and that just is because of the nature of how many claims are going through and how many disabled veterans are seeking compensation.
Yeah, and the fact that the claims process has been expanded so with the recent PACT Act and the VA is understaffed, all of those things I think certainly contribute. But do you think there are specific areas of VA law that are particularly beneficial for veterans to understand and that you would want to help to educate them on?
Yeah, the two areas I think that are most important would just be how a combined disability rating is calculated. I think a lot of veterans don't understand that process where it's not additive. It's essentially, there's specific calculations, but the gist is each disability takes away remaining percentage that's left. So you don't just add it up to get 100%. To get 100%, you have to essentially get more. And I think if you don't understand how that math is calculated, it feels deceptive or underhanded or something. So I think it's important to understand exactly how the combined disability rating is calculated, so that way you're not caught off guard and perceiving that it's some sort of slight to you when it's just that's how it's done. And then the second piece would be to just understand what's required for service connecting a disability, which is a current diagnosis, an in-service event, and a medical nexus between those two things. Essentially, I currently have symptoms or a problem. This event happened in the military that's related to this, and here's the proof that they're related. The proof itself is not a substantially high burden compared to other areas of law, but it still requires an explanation of how this event led to this current condition.
Yeah, I certainly would agree with you about that. A large percentage of the cases that we see overall are cases where the veteran's been unable to make that medical connection between the current problem and what's happened in the service. So tell me, how does your experience in the military help you in advocating for policy changes or improvements in the VA system?
So a lot of my work has been improvement for trying to shine a light on what the service member experience is. As we've talked about before, I do a lot of work around service member suicide advocacy and trying to get data showing what could be some contributing factors. And I see it also as that's going to be a benefit to the VA system as well. If we know, in this instance, if we know people that are more prone to suicidality through their career field, if that can be given to the VA system, they would maybe understand that these people might need immediate mental health treatment or things to that effect, but also there's a distinct possibility that when this report comes out speaking about suicidality by job code across all services for the last 20 years, that might be something that we can point to in a claim saying this person is claiming a mental health condition. He says from his experience working in this particular career field, this report shows this career field has a higher rate of suicides during the time that he was in that career field. Therefore, that is at least probative that he experienced something at a higher degree than someone in a different career field. So I guess I do an indirect sort of advocacy for veterans.
Well, Chris, I know we've talked about this in another episode, but why don't you tell our viewers a little about the advocacy, specific advocacy around this report that you're talking about?
So right now, there is not public information out there of suicide rates by job code for the military. And that's information I was seeking because I think there's some correlation between suicidality in certain career fields, which is probably a lagging indicator for policy decisions, resource allocation, things like that, which would be, maybe some leading indicators for suicidality in the future. And I initially asked the Air Force for it, eventually the DoD for it, and they said they wouldn't give it to me. So I worked with Senator Angus King to commission the study that's going to be released in December of 2023. And I attribute a lot of that to the fact that I happened to be in Maine at the time. I don't think I would have had access to the Senate Armed Services Committee if I was a resident of California, one of 50 million or 60 million or something like that. I think Maine's a very unique place, and I was very fortunate to be able to ask my representative for this and got the bill drafted and signed, so it's now law. And I think there's going to be a lot of follow-on questions from that, where I think people are going to start asking questions about what's going on to these unique sorts of career fields.
That's very helpful. In your opinion, can you just tell our viewers what you think the significant advantages are to working with an experienced attorney in VA claims?
Well, first of all, probably the most profound advantage is they don't have to manage it anymore. They have essentially an entire team that understands the process inside and out that is going to start managing it for them, letting them know, responding to appeals or coordinating hearings, ensuring that they have the hearing link, and even maybe getting independent evaluations for medical issues, mental issues, employment impacts of their disabilities. And these are things that they could potentially do. It's just, it would take a significant amount of time. And then on top of all that, just the background and the understanding of VA disability law, everything that we've talked about on this podcast and all the podcasts before this, that's a lot of knowledge that is at our fingertips that would take, I can't fathom how many hours it would take to kind of accumulate enough to be able to function at the same level.
It is true that we have the advantage of having seen pretty much every kind of claim that comes along and figured out how you do it. But tell me, has your military service influenced your views on the importance of perseverance in the VA system?
Yeah, absolutely. What I talked about before, like it's a one foot in front of the other and also a hurry up and wait process at the same time. But just because you get a denial, just because it's not rated appropriately, you keep pushing and you maintain your appeals. And if the decisions are wrong, it takes time, and that's also where having an attorney doing a lot of that work for you means that persistence is more passive than active, because that's what we do.
What you mean by that, I think, if I'm understanding you right, is the veteran can take a more passive role and doesn't have to carry that burden on his own shoulders.
Yeah, like they don't have to call and do all the forms and do all the things, because that's something that we're managing, especially those timetables are so important. I think very often when a veteran's trying to do their own disability claim, if they lose sight of the appeal window, like that can cost them thousands and thousands of dollars depending on what the claim is. And that's where perseverance and persistence, it takes a lot of time, attention, and energy. So in our case, we do that work for them, and that allows them to just persevere through us.
I think that's a nice way to put it. I think that really helps to explain it to our listeners. Tell me, looking forward, how do you hope to continue using your background to assist veterans in navigating this VA disability system?
Well, so looking forward, it's really going to be about learning as much as possible. And that's where I'm really fortunate to be at this firm, where there's so many experienced attorneys, because even though I have this long history of being in the military, I've been practicing law for a year and a half. So for me, I'm in a weird state being as old as I am, a retired military member, and a brand new private to the firm. So while my experience is very helpful, I really enjoy learning about all the ways that we can use all the levers and all the tools at our disposal to maximize the outcome for our clients. And I'm looking forward to the day where I'm answering all those questions instead of asking all those questions.
Well, you've certainly been answering some of those questions already, but let's talk about that for a second. Can you just give an example of a case that you've been working on where you think your military background really helped you to understand how the case should go together in order to effectively explain it to a VA judge?
Yeah, I recently had a case of somebody that was in aircraft maintenance as well, so obviously my entire military background informed me for what his experience would have been like. And so when he was describing service-connected, or when he was describing conditions that he believed was service-connected, ironically, those are conditions that I have that are service-connected. So that's about as close as you can get to a direct experience that informed me for the client's benefit.
In that same context, cases you've been working on, can you think of any other examples where you think your overall military experience, even if you weren't in the same kind of MOS as the client, has been helpful in understanding how to formulate the claim and present it?
I think so. I think when I understand that sometimes things go unreported because of cultural issues, but I've seen across, a lot of clients from all backgrounds and all different services, where they describe some sort of event or change in their service, and they can explain maybe the cultural or organizational sort of influences that cause that change. Typically you see it with mental health, maybe anxiety or something like that. I can very easily see how it happens because those are the same sort of influences I saw in my own military career. And then you can start to extrapolate. If they were an outstanding performer for the first 3 years and they said that they entered a sort of like a harmful environment, maybe socially, professionally, or otherwise, and then you start to see these cascading echo effects of that, I can very easily sort of understand that in that intervening time, that is a harm they experience. And I can remember certain organizations I worked at in the military that also had that effect on people that I knew.
And you would be able to take their military records, point out the kind of decrease in performance that's reflected there to a VA judge in support of the claim.
Absolutely. I remember I saw a military record in particular that had a specific citation for outstanding achievement for this individual in performance for a certain sort of exercise or event. And that's radically different than a unit level award that's given just for all participants in the unit. So understanding the differences between broad unit level awards, even if it has a commander sending a letter down to the individual saying you helped contribute to this unit award, understanding the nuance between a individualized citation for achievement or performance is much stronger evidence, and that's something that I certainly picked up on as a prior service member.
Well, sadly, we are out of time for today, but I appreciate you spending the time, Chris, to talk about your background and your contributions, and I hope all our viewers will come back and see our podcast next week.
All right, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.